Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
My God, it's full of stars.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I have my companion in tow, Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine and demand to be recognized as a goddess.
Yeah, don't we all? Hey? Yeah, so we are past season 3. We're now into our bonus episodes. Pretty far gone, actually. We've done our little sojourn into Terry Gilliam. We've done the sort of the Imagination trilogy and the 12 Monkeys, and now we're into a proper block. We're going to be talking about what I would consider to be a British institution, something that one of the few things that we've exported into the world that we can be truly proud of, for the most part, Doctor Who. But as Julian and I, we do love Doctor Who. We'll get into that in a moment. But like, we're not going to be doing the modern Doctor. This isn't sort of new Who. So there'll be no Eccleston, no Tennant, no Matt Smith, or any of that. We're doing classic Doctor Who. But more importantly, just to explain this, we're not going to be doing everything. There's an awful lot there. There's 7 Doctors, hundreds of episodes, hundreds of stories. So what we've done is we've done some research and we've chosen the most well liked or the most well regarded story from each of the Doctors. So we have 7 episodes and we're going to be going through each of those. And so we're starting with William Hartnell Doctor, and the story we've chosen for the first Doctor is the Aztecs. But Julian, before we get into the actual story, let's talk about the Doctor in general. So as an American, and obviously I think you've had this, it's been available on BBC Worldwide and PBS and that sort of thing. So what's your relationship with Doctor Who?
Well, as a dirty Yank, my experience with Doctor Who was much like sort of Red Dwarf. It was played late at night on the local PBS station. Thank God for public television, which we don't have much over here, but we have one station. And so it would play the stuff late at night, and I would stay up late to watch like the British, block of stuff. And I knew that they were British, but I didn't really understand how old they were, or, they were presented without any context. There wasn't like an announcer saying, and now we're going to be playing, the best of the BBC or something, So these two would just start playing. And Doctor Who was inscrutable because it was always, one episode out of a serial. I didn't understand how any of it worked, but I just watched it. And, I didn't really come to love it until later. It was Red Dwarf that I could fall in love with right away. But Doctor Who was a sort of acquired taste.
Yeah, I agree with that. Red Dwarf is an easy access because, like you say, you can pick up pretty much any episode and you get the premise and you get the characters and you're off to the races. Doctor Who is one of those, like you say, you can go, oh yeah, I've seen this one. This looks interesting. And like you say, if you pick up like episode like with this, if you pick up episode 3 of the Aztecs, like you've got no clue what the concept of the show is or what who anyone really is. And you might pick up the next one and like, oh, they keep calling him the Doctor, but he looks completely different. Like it's a different actor. So it's a show that sort of comes with incredibly it's a show that now comes with incredibly detailed lore. Like they filled the gaps, and there's like been all these retcons that have like filled the gaps and said, for example, I won't go into it because I don't fully understand it, but like there's a character in this one, Susan Foreman, who is the Doctor's granddaughter.
Yeah.
So the first Doctor, they didn't really acknowledge his Gallifreyan heritage until they were like, yeah, William Hartnell's getting a little old, and he keeps forgetting his lines. we need to replace him, or we need to shut down the show, or we need to replace him. And they decided to sort of introduce the regeneration and all the alien thing. So that didn't come to the end of the first Doctor, as far as I'm aware. So,
Yeah, I think that's right. And, I thought we could talk somewhat just about Hartnell and sort of the original conception of the show and what are, because, even being British, it's not like you, I assume, I don't want to make any assumptions, but I assume that British children aren't put in front of the television and forced to watch the history of Doctor Who from start to finish. So what was your encounter with, like understanding the different doctors and with Hartnell in specific in the earliest years of the show?
Well, it's weird because it is. You say that like you don't get stuck down in front of it. Yeah, there's not a test. You don't reach an age. You're like, right, you're going to pass it. Sort of like the BBC test. No, when I was a kid, my first Doctor was Sylvester McCoy, the Seventh Doctor, and I had this sort of like knowledge really because like it's like I was too young to watch it. It was there, and I sort of watched it, but was never really paying attention. Wasn't really until sort of like the mid '80s when Sylvester McCoy came in that I was old enough to be like, oh, I get what this is. Like this show, I get what this show is, but I'd been reading comics, kids comics and stuff like the Beano and the Dandy and stuff like that, and they'd made jokey references to this thing. There's a series in the Beano called the Bash Street Kids, which is a bunch of like ne'er-do-wells in sort of like Beano land and these school kids, and there were several sort of like Doctor Who jokes in that, but it would reference earlier generations. So you'd have like the Tom Baker version or the Peter Davison version would appear in it, sort of like or caricatures of them. So that you do have this sort of osmosis where you're like, oh, I know of Doctor Who, like I knew of it, and it wasn't until like say, in fact, it wasn't until it went off air. They cancelled it, and then you'd see it on reruns and things and other bits and pieces. Like you didn't really see anything, like but there was VHSs available. But for me, like it really made a big hit when the movie came out. The Paul McGann 1996, I think it is. They sort of, and then all of a sudden the BBC were like, well, if we're doing that, we should really sort of probably do something to let people, to remind people what this thing was. And so they put a few of the old Doctor Who's on TV in the 90s. And that was when I was like, oh, this is actually really good. And I started to seek out some of it on VHS. I mean, by that point, I was watching like Next Generation and other shows like that. So I was well into sort of like, the geek sphere by then. So yeah, it was one of those where I was aware of it, but it sort of fell out of favour because the BBC didn't like it, and then sort of made its way back. But yeah. I
mean, for me, I had some of it in the 90s, but it was especially after the Davies show came on that I, felt, started just, I sort of organized a project of watching all of the old stuff and then reached a point where I was like, yeah, I don't know how much I want to continue with this. But I have to say that I really love the original premise. And I think that while, like, obviously we come at it with the whole Gallifreyan mythology and, we know all of that. It's hard not to impose that on the early stuff. But I love the original premise of the show. I love the Doctor as a curmudgeon-y, kind of not likable old guy, right? Who's sort of the grandfather figure. It's so weird that it's even named Doctor Who, not only because there's no name, but because he's not intended to be the main character. And I think the original concept, of having the companions, I mean, this was intended as a kid's show, and having, school teachers and the young girl who's the granddaughter, Susan, as, sort of the audience identification figure, and then the teachers to guide them through these episodes.
Yes.
Is such a brilliant concept, and the original concept of alternating between, real science fiction serials and historic serials that would introduce kids to what the Aztecs were, or Marco Polo.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, one of the things that jumped to mind when I was watching this, because it's quite, we're used to, if you all you're used to is New Who, if you're used to sort of like David Tennant running around looking sexy in his suit, fine. That's the action adventure Doctor Who. That's where they go all over the time and space, or to different planets, and there's a morality code there, but they don't really. There's no, or there's very little education. It's not designed to do that. They reintroduced it with with Whittaker, the latest Doctor, and they have done that. They've gone back. They did the whole civil rights movement and Rosa Parks. They've done it with a couple of other episodes, and it's actually weirdly works really well. Where they go, yeah, we've gone back to this time, and you get this thing that's similar to this story again of like future people, present day people trying to impose their sensibilities and moralities onto these past societies, and it just not working. Like people going like, doesn't work that way. That's not how this works. And so I like that concept. But there was a few moments in this that felt a little bit like Magic School Bus, where it's sort of like, the story sort of pauses very slightly from saying, well, that's what the Aztecs do, and this is how human sacrifice works into their religion. And you're like, right, cool, that is cool. But you could see that premise coming through, but it didn't impede my enjoyment of this story at all. So I agree. I do like the concept.
I mean, I have to say that I find, especially with old Doctor Who, it's not so much the lack of budget and sort of like poor combat sequences, and
we'll come to that. We'll go to both of those.
And we have to remember that, these episodes were shot in a day. They'd like rehearse for a few days, but then they'd be like, right, film is expensive. We're shooting this entire episode in a day. And it's intended to be broadcast once. And famously, the BBC scrapped a lot of these old episodes. But, going back to Hartnell and this whole era, I like Susan as a companion. I think she leaves in the second Dalek serial. I think the original pilot, the first episode, is one of the best episodes ever made of any sci-fi show. It sells the concept. It works brilliantly. You understand why these companions are there. They're not merely a counterpose to the Doctor, but I mean, they work as a group. Really well. I love seeing Susan, like know stuff that she shouldn't as a kid in school. And, the Doctor hiding out in a warehouse with the TARDIS. And then like the Dalek stuff, I love the first two Dalek serials, which were adapted into the movies. Those work well. But for me, the number one problem with old Doctor Who is the pacing. And I can deal with the low budget stuff. It's the pacing. And I always feel like even with the Aztecs, I feel like if this were, I want to edit this down to like a 60-minute episode, and I think right around that, where you're keeping, 2/3 of it or so, it would flow so much better. I mean, the basic story is all there. The characters are there. There's a lot of stuff that's interesting going on. But that pacing is a problem for me.
Joe, it was one of the things that really stood out for me, because there are scenes. And again, this is the Aztecs is across 4 episodes. Each episode's about 23 to 25 minutes long. They're not hugely long. But as you say, sort of like they have to fill that. And there's not, this thing of we'll get to the story, this plot in a minute, but like, and it's clear in other ends as well, and it happens throughout. Like, this is I would say this becomes a bit of a problem with Doctor Who well up until probably the Baker years, like Tom Baker. They sort of seem to resolve it a little bit then. But there's this thing of like, we can't spend any more money, so we can't introduce anything new, but we've got to fill the time, so we're going to have a dialogue scene, or we're going to have this, and they're usually sort of like perfunctory and sometimes even like plot adjacent, where you're like, doesn't really matter, but it fills the time. And you can sort of spot them in every episode. You're like, yeah, don't need this one. Like, you say, scrap this, scrap that. And I think you're right. Like, you could strip this down to like 60, probably shorter, like 50 to 60 minutes, and it would have a really tight Doctor Who episode. But yeah, I think the pacing is a part of the problem. One of the things I was going to say, actually, you said about this, and again, the pacing. One of the things that I'd never really intently watched a Hartnell Doctor before. Like, I've seen bits and pieces. I think I've seen a couple of the other serials, but like mainly the ones that relate to the Hammer films, the ones we're gonna discuss as well. And again, it was quite a while ago. So I'm watching it this time, and there was something that really struck me was we mentioned it when we talked about Quatermass. Now, we talked about the Hammer films Quatermass and the Americanized angry Quatermass. But talking more about the TV version, the Nigel Neal, the version that he created in the 50s, William Hartnell's Doctor is so much a progression of that character. Although they didn't do any more Quatermass, like, it's quite clear that the BBC were like, do you remember that thing we did? Yeah, more of that, please. Like, but we're gonna, instead of doing aliens coming to Earth, we're gonna do time travel, but we can introduce those elements. And there's so much of that character, that sort of the TV version. And again, you say about the pacing, it's exactly the same from this when you watch the original Quatermass TV show, in that they were like, right, these are broadcast live. We've got to fill the time. We've been told we've got to do this many episodes. And so we've got to have these extra things. So there are episodes when you're like, it's no wonder Hammer were able to sort of bring these down to a 90-minute or less movie. And so, yeah, it's just, I think it's the nature of TV at the time. Like, you know, when you watch, there's a reason that Doctor Who now works as a one and done for the most part episodes, because they know they can tell those stories quick and move on. But I think that pacing thing sticks around for quite some time until the BBC figures a few things out well into the 70s.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, and I think even the Tom Baker stuff, you know, has some of that. You know, it's more just historical, you know, changing styles that, you know, produced before, you know, MTV. And some of it. Yeah, I sort of feel that the historical episodes, and again, I love the sort of counterpose of historical and then classic sci-fi alien stuff. I feel like the historical episodes suffer more from that pacing. That I can watch, you know, a Dalek serial from the era, and I know it's slow, but I'm watching like them go through a Dalek headquarters, you know, and the Dalek looks a little daft, and you know, but it's still charming, you know. It's like, oh right, they're on a spaceship, you know. Like, I can put up with that a little more than the historical episodes, where I'm really glad that they did them, and I admire that they did them. But then I also feel like, right, what you're in Mexico encountering the Aztecs. How many characters do you encounter? You know, they all look sort of white, and most of it is a kind of like play-like kind of costume drama of, you know, every companion running into trouble, and you know, not that they don't do a good job of it, but you know, there is this sort of like, right, okay, you're in Roman times, but you have 8 actors, and you know, they're gonna have a lot of conversations in different rooms.
Yeah, your soundstage is this big, and you're limited to 3 sets. Yeah, I know what you mean. It does limit it at times. I mean, you know, I went through and I watched some of the other Doctor Who stuff, and you know, similar things will occur. It becomes a bit of a joke, you know, when they do go to a planet. Like, how many quarries in Wales can they film in before it's exact? You know, before each planet looks a little bit similar. You know, sort of. It's these things again. You know, I mean, in this one again, I don't want to knock the budget, because I actually really enjoy a lot of the stuff. But like, there's a set, the Aztec temple, where Barbara sort of is, you know, seated for a large portion of this, and then as you walk out of it, they've tried to give it distance by having this sort of like drop, like a you know, a sort of a scene drop of these Aztec temples and stuff. Several times you can see wrinkles in that, and in one point you can even see it move, because it's clearly just a curtain.
Right.
And I'm like, I'm not going to knock you for that, because that's what you could do. At least you attempted to have an exterior.
Yeah, and that stuff doesn't bother me. That's the sort of like low budget stuff that doesn't bother me. And actually, I thought that was those sort of painted backdrops were one of the highlights of the episode. For me, that I'm always looking at those. You and I both love painted backdrops.
Yes. Yeah,
they look great. I mean, it is a little weird thinking this whole action takes place like high on a temple,
Yeah.
But it does really set the scene,
Yeah, it is interesting. We'll get into some of the stuff like that because again, like, there's some set pieces. There's the garden, and that's got like a similar one behind it, but it looks fine. Like I'm like, yeah, this is good. I'm glad they're trying to. At least I appreciate they're not doing it, or they haven't just built a high wall and gone, it's the sky. They've tried to give it a bit of a vista. But yeah, no, it's good. So really, I think the Hartnell Doctor is interesting. I think the companion set. I like the companion setup. I want to get into that because in particular, I think Ian is interesting. In this episode. But yeah, should we crack on? I'll give a bit of a blurb here. I went to Doctor Who Wiki. So I'll give a blurb of it, and then I shall quickly run through the characters. So The Aztecs is the 6th serial in the British science fiction series Doctor Who, which was first broadcast on BBC One for 4 weeks, starting from May the 23rd to June 13th, 1964. It was written by John Le Carrotti and directed by John Crockett. In the serial, the first Doctor, his granddaughter Susan, and teachers Ian Chesterton and Barbara Wright arrive in Mexico during the Aztec Empire in the 15th century. Barbara becomes mistaken for the goddess Yetaxa and accepts the identity in hope of persuading the Aztecs to give up human sacrifice despite the Doctor's warning about changing history. The Doctor is played by William Hartnell. The companions, Ian Chesterton is played by William Russell, Barbara Wright by Jacqueline Hill, and Susan Foreman by Carolyn Ann Ford. Now these are going to be a bit harder. The Aztecs, Ortlock, played by Keith Pyatt, Latoxel by John Ringham, Ixta by Ian Cullen. I think that's all you really need to know beyond that, to be perfectly honest. The only other one that really is of any note is the the perfect victim, played by Andre Boulay. So that's what it is. So the first episode, the first thing I want to note about this whole thing. This first episode starts with, and this is how much times have changed, a miniature, not a particularly good miniature, of the TARDIS disappearing from a hillside somewhere next to some water. So you get the typical sounds, and the TARDIS disappears, and then they arrive in Mexico, 15th century Mexico. Now, I haven't gone back and checked, but I assume that as we see at the end of this serial, it knocks onto the next serial. I assume that disappearing would have been the end of the last serial because they have that continuation. So I kind of like that little model. It's not great, but it's charming. It's a charming way of starting this series. But they arrive in the tomb of a former witch doctor or witch high priest, Yetoxel, and go straight to grave robbing, basically.
True.
But yeah, it's interesting. Like there's a body lying there. It's got the bits on, and Barbara basically puts on a bracelet, and they start. But again, you talked about this format. Straight away is exposition about the Aztecs and their burial practices and all this other stuff. And so you can see straight away this is an educational program, but it's good. It's a good setup, like this whole, in the tomb. What are your thoughts from the beginning?
Yeah, I quite like the tomb. I mean, I'm in it at that point. I think that very quickly. I would say yes, there is this sort of like exposition, and Barbara especially is because she knows history. She sort of takes the lead on that. It's not very long. And in fact, one of my complaints about the history episodes is, how little history is really given in them, right? It's like, yes, you get that sort of magic bus sort of explanation, but it's like, right, we're going to entertain you for 2 hours worth of television. And in that 2 hours, you're basically going to come away with 2 sentences of understanding. And, one of my objections to this is that the entire plot revolves around, yes, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice, And there's this counterposition between, Barbara goes out of her way to say, yes, but that was only one side of Aztec civilization. And history, sort of basically white people only remember, this dark side. But they had wisdom and good things too, which are never explained and which you never see in the entire episode. And no,
I would dispute that, because one of the things that's interesting is you do get this high priest, and we'll talk about them in a minute, but you get in particular this idea of the garden, and this idea, because obviously lifespans were a lot shorter then, they weren't living this. But when you reach your 52nd year, you basically got to retire, and people looked after you, and you got to live in this sort of garden and live out your time. And so they do sort of they hint at, it's not explicit, but they do hint at these other things where the Doctor sort of has one of those subplots that requires it doesn't really go anywhere, is he ends up being engaged to one of the women in this garden area. But their conversations are this thing of sort of we have, everyone's equal. This woman here was made baskets, but this here guy was a stonemason, and and we all just lived together. And so there's little bits like that we care for people. And then they counter that by saying, but then the high priests are determined to kill the perfect victim, or the perfect sacrifice or whatever. So you don't get it. It's not explicit, and I think it could be hammered home a little more, but it's sort of in there a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. But I find the Aztec civilization was a vast, expansive thing of titanic structures, and was part of a vast network that went beyond Aztec civilization, of trading groups that went all the way through North America into South America. This is a vast sort of quasi empire that is, none of that's important. What's important is they have nice gardens and they like killing people. Okay.
It comes down to the limit again. This is limitations of television and the budgets and some of the things. But you could have characters in that explain these things, couldn't you? Yes. Well, Eutoxia is here in this empire and this temple, but our empire spreads from here to here, sort of thing. You could do those things. The other thing I'd say is don't forget as well. This sounds incredibly short-sighted, but this is technically American history. From a British standpoint, this is sort of if this was about the British Civil War or Tudor England, I guarantee you there'd be a lot more. Mm-hmm. But at this point, they're they existed in Mexico in the 15th century, and that's all you really need to know. We just think they're cool. You've seen them. You're probably going to do a topic on them at school, and we're going to give you enough information. It feels like that as well. They're we're showing you this history, but because you are British children, you don't really, it's not important. I think there's an element of that as well.
Yeah, and the other thing is recognizing those pyramids, recognizing the sort of stones with the engravings on them. To your point, that's a big, we know a lot more now about Aztec civilization than even I was taught as a kid in school. Precious little. I'm not sure that we were taught any more than you. But yeah, a big part of that knowledge is beyond just the school summary, recognizing those styles and the art.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's interesting. Again, one of the things I wanted to point out on that front is the costuming. Mm-hmm. The show's in black and white. We should highlight. So there's no sort of crazy colors and golds and all that kind of thing. But they do go to some lengths to at least attempt some level of authenticity. It's not authentic. This was bashed together by some poor women in the background in the costuming department of the BBC. But some of it looks really good. And even to the extent of yes, I'm sure there's some let's just call it some skin darkening. It's blackface. they're darkening people's, at least Ortlock in particular. It's evident on, and also Latoxel. But then they try that thing of like, then they've got the strip across him, and they've got some other bits, and sort of like they're trying to set up. I think there's a level of authenticity they're trying to introduce, and the helmets or the hats that look like a bird or a leopard or something, like they've got things like that. And they were sort of like, and so I was quite impressed where they could have just gone, no one, this people at home watching this on a Sunday evening aren't going to really know. Doesn't matter. Bang them in. What costumes have we got left from something else? So they could have done that, but I don't think they did, and I think I appreciate at least that as well.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that John Lucarotti, who was the writer of the Aztecs, was really fascinated by Aztec civilization, and this came out of that. And the serial was praised when it originally aired for taking those pains to be authentic. So it's all relative. I mean, apparently one of the things that they're least authentic about is showing skin and nudity, which you couldn't do on the BBC. So authenticity is limited by British propriety.
Yeah. These warriors that would have been wearing nothing but a loincloth, watch me put them in padded jackets.
Right. It's like ancient Greek wrestling. Not going to be presented authentically in either of our countries, frankly.
No. Yeah. Oof. No. Don't want any of that. But yeah, so I there are elements like that I actually really thought, like, I was like, wow, this has actually really gone out of its way to attempt those things. But then there was other things like this. There were certain things that I find as a bugbear in this element. This idea of, because I've thought about it a great deal, this idea of a modern person being hurled backwards in time and then being considered a god, or being able to sort of like wow someone with technology and then all of a sudden becoming sort of like, a part of the royal court or something like that. Let's be clear. If any of us were hurled backwards in time, we would all be dead in a gutter somewhere, dying of starvation, having diseases that we no longer have, or having mugged and murdered. Yeah, like, or we'd be burnt as a witch. Like, there's no way any of this ever, is happening, and it's always bothered me, because it's just ridiculous. But
I was also bothered. I mean, by the basic sort of. I mean, and this gets into the presentation of race. I mean, you pointed out the sort of blackface thing. I like the stripe on the face. I mean, it gives a sense of difference. But I couldn't get over how, of course, they're speaking with a British accent. That's not my accent, so it's very obvious to me. Whereas if they spoke like Ted Koppel, I wouldn't notice it. But I'm very conscious of that. These are white Brits pretending to be pretending to be Aztecs, and the idea that their response to seeing a white school teacher from the 20th century is, well, she's an incarnation of the goddess, strikes me as utterly ridiculous.
Their greatest evidence is she comes out of the tomb wearing the bracelet.
Yes.
And I'm like, yeah, but 3 other people came out and all. Like, is it just that bracelet seems to be enough? Fair enough. All right. Yeah, I have a bit of a problem with it. I know they need it to progress the story, but there are other things that could have been a coincidence that could have driven that home as like her perception. But the other thing you say about the cast being British, and again, again, it's one of the things that I sort of let go. I even let go now you have to let that go in modern Doctor Who a lot of times. Yeah. Where you're like, all right, so you're on this planet, but they're all from Essex. Fair enough. I'm not going to worry about that.
Well, my version of that is I always think, and this is the American standpoint, like, this alien is oddly obsessed with this island nation, that's cool. That's part of the charm, but this alien's version of the world seems to be like the cartoon of New York, with the rest of North America being shrunk around New York City. Like, there's Britain, and then I know India exists.
Yeah, it's that thing again. We can get into with other Who bits, with this thing about how important the human race is in this great galaxy, and you're like, not particularly.
Right.
but yeah, one of the, like I said, this thing of being recognised as your toxin is interesting, like, you know. But the other thing is, obviously, these are 60s women. This is 1964. This was produced and released, and their hair, for the amount of time that they are in Aztec, 15th century Aztec, like, I'm like, wow, your hair is incredibly well coiffured under each of these houses. And there's little things like that where I'm like, I know it's television, I know that's the point, but it's sort of like, it just seems kind of silly as you watch it now. But
Well, it's funny. I didn't even think about that, but you know, I often object to that in like The Walking Dead and shows like that today, where I'm just like, right, where are you getting your, heating your hair, blow drying your hair? Your hair has clearly been blow dried, yet you are struggling to find water. I don't think so.
Yeah, we've been walking for 6 weeks. Yeah, but your hair's looking brilliant. I know, thank you.
You're right. Not a strand out of place.
Yeah. It's a similar thing with this. And again, like, and the same thing goes for this whole thing of the sort of, you know, surviving in that time. One of the things I want to talk about is Ian, and again, this idea we'll talk about, because this idea of notion of human sacrifice and the way the whole episode or the whole serial, as you say, is driven by this notion of preventing human sacrifice, but then ends with 2 deaths, which is really, I thought that felt quite interesting. But Ian sort of goes back, and he's a school teacher. Okay, and I haven't seen a great deal more, so I don't want him speaking out of place. But all of a sudden, he goes back to 15th century Aztec, Mexico, and he's a badass.
Yes. Well, this is definitely a weakness of the serial. I mean, I will say in defense of the setup, like, I mean, if you look at the original, I mean, and back then there wasn't the idea that the Doctor was going to change and the companions were going to change. I mean, I think Susan is the first to leave of the original cast, but that was the cast. I mean, there was no idea of having rotating companions and whatnot. And of that original setup, you know, very clearly Susan is the kid identification figure. The Doctor was the inscrutable grandfather. And then of the teachers, Barbara is sort of beautiful and sensitive, and Ian was sort of the closest you get to like the swashbuckling Han Solo.
Yes.
You know, like, I'm a white Britisher of, you know, a certain age. I'm the adventurer character. But he clearly is fighting like the strongest warrior the Aztecs have to have, and no problem. You know, the Brits are made. Look, he went through the Blitz. It's that's
there is no, stiff. All you need is a strong cup of tea and a stiff upper lip, and you can face anything. But there is that notion, like when he takes him on and he gives him like one of those pressure, and I hate this as well. Like, you know, I'm going to take you out with a pressure point sort of grab. Like, yeah, you've applied a Vulcan nerve pinch. Well done.
Yes.
Like it's that sort of silly. And then later on they have the fight and stuff, and it's fine. I'm fine with that. You know, again, certain characters, and they've done this better. And again, we have to make comparisons to Modern Who and modern TV shows. They will do that because they're able to do that now. Where they'll go, oh no, this is the warrior character, and this is the intellectual, and this is something. They can set them up, and they'll give you that thing because they're quite comfortable now with saying, yeah, he's a meathead, but he's there as the muscle or whatever. Like, you can have those characters. But this, they're trying to cover all their bases. That, yeah, he's a teacher, but he's actually a fighter. You're like, well, why don't you just make him a policeman or something else? Weirdly, to say in the films, which we will cover in the next episode, he's played by a guy called Roy Walker, who is very different to the guy who's playing Ian in this show. So he's almost like a head shorter and and not a fighter in the slightest. So yeah, but no, this idea of him joining the Aztec military, becoming a general and stuff, it's like, you know, I don't know, like, what was the end game of this? Like, if we can't get back Doctor, then what? He's going to lead the Aztecs armies? Like, it's all.
It's very strange. I mean, and you can see how a decision was made to sort of give each of these characters something to do, right? Yeah. Clearly, it's cool that it focuses on Barbara as, Yataka. So that's cool, even if I don't buy the basis for that. And I don't know that proving that she really is or isn't is a particularly dramatic way to go with that. You know, it seems to distract from me from the central conundrum of, do I get rid of human sacrifice, and what are the consequences if I am given godlike powers to determine the society's course? How do I understand that? That really, you know, is mentioned, but it gets put aside for you know, the drama of proving whether she's, you know, disproving that she's really the goddess.
Yeah.
And in the same way, everybody gets kind of something to do, you know, and Ian's job is, you know, to fight Ixta and, you know, survive. And it's not the most interesting thing to do with Ian.
No, but one of the things I would say is that about how they've set it up, because you're right, they each get different elements, but and it's not handled well, because the majority of the time is spent with Barbara, or, you know, and if anything, Susan is the least served in this serial. But they each enter like a different facet of Aztec society. Like, you know, Barbara is seen as this god, Yatuxa. The doctor, because he's old, gets taken to this garden with these other sort of like retirees, and, you know, they get to drink cocoa. Ian, because he's a strong man, gets in, sort of like drafted into the Aztec military, so you get to look at like the weapons and their strategies and how they did things. And then Susan is drafted into, and they call it a seminary. So she's been drafted in to become a young priestess or something. Like, she's being educated, and so you see that she is being. They had education, so it does try to. Again, they're not going to tell you of them, but they keep trying to drop these things of like, look, they had education. Yes, they had a military, and then they looked after their elderly. Like, it's a real sort of like, you know. But again, it doesn't go anywhere. But then each of them, and again with Barbara, you get the whole priesthood thing of like how they get like a city, you know, the politics of the high priests, which is probably more akin to Catholic Church than it is Aztec priests, I think. But anyway, the I do like those things, but then each of them seems to apply their 20th century perspectives onto that. But Susan's is actually one of the most interesting. Because they're like, well, we've educated you. You are clearly educated enough now to be allocated a husband. And she's like, hey, I'm not having that. Hey, oh, no. And so there's this whole thing then about, you know, she's like, well, no, if I have a husband, I shall choose them. And so I like some of those conflicts. But again, weirdly, they're not explored enough to be of any merit.
No, I agree with you. And I like seeing Susan and Barbara, to a lesser degree, spout. Well, I shouldn't use the word spout. Say what would be, you know, 20th century sort of quasi-feminist, especially in comparison, strong lines, right? I mean, this is what you were getting at, of sort of characters being thrown outside of their historical context. Yeah. And that, you know, you're quite right. I mean, this does give an occasion to not only see, in theory, different aspects of Aztec society, but also sort of that contrast of values. But then I wonder, you know, the Aztecs don't seem sufficiently dumbfounded, right?
That's a really good point. Is the reaction to all of this from the Aztecs is often like a shrug of the shoulders. It's a bit like, oh, all right.
Well, that's not proper. All right, on with the next thing. It's like,
oddly, the Aztec reaction to these things is very British.
Yes. Well, and I mean, the reaction to Oliver wanting more food is more outraged than the Aztecs to, you know, 20th century British values.
Yeah, it's it's funny that they say that's the response. I'm trying to think of the other one that's in the garden. You know, that when the doctor goes around the things and they're talking about them and stuff. Again, it feels this like very British thing of sort of like, you know, he's leading into this idea of like, you know, oh, they look after their elderly, but like there's almost like a bite back of like, yeah, but you don't honor them, like you're not using their knowledge for things. And it's almost like, well, I'm pretty sure you're conveying the words they are using seem to be conveying the wrong message for what they're trying to show, because they do talk about how knowledge is passed on, but then they also talk about the elderly being forgotten in this garden, and you're like, yeah, you're sort of taking with one hand and giving with the other on some of these messages. I'm not sure you know from episode to episode what it is you're trying to tell. And I think that comes again, like you said, to the filming schedule, which is like, right, move fast, fast, fast. That they probably some of the continuity of dialogue probably gets lost. But when you watch,
I also wonder. Go ahead.
It's when you watch it with the critical eye, it becomes a little bit more obvious that there's some of the problems that they're facing.
Yeah, and let's be fair. I mean, and we do this when we talk about Twilight Zone on Patreon. That it's only fair to point out these were not expected to be perused. These, more than half a century later by people, analyzing every line of dialogue and capable of rewinding and watching every prop flop around
in high definition.
Yeah. But it occurs to me that, to your point, that in a show that is talky, it seems to me that at least to my current sensibilities, that a lot of that conversation could go to, you could make something just as talky that really underlined or accented exactly these kinds of dramas, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you're pointing out, the depiction of the care for the elderly. It would be very easy to have the doctor, bring that up and sort of complain about, right, you come to me when you need poison, but, otherwise, I don't feel useful. And especially, Susan, like you said, they're like kind of surprised at her refusing to marry the perfect victim, and then they sort of move on. It seems to me that it would be more interesting to have them comment on those things and sort of wrestle with how we understand history and our own biases. But this is especially true with Barbara and the sort of human sacrifice thing. It's one of the things, of course, coming at it today, right? The idea that a great civilization would destroy itself. First of all, I'm not convinced at all that, while the excesses of human sacrifice of the Aztecs are shocking when you read about them, quite astounding. And the notion of controlling the weather and the crops, well, that goes back to primitive humanity, seems so dumb to although I say this and people pray for rain to this day. But it seems the idea of a great civilization falling, does that not apply to 20th century British civilization, or indeed to the post-Enlightenment Western experiment? That's not going to be important, right? That is not what this show exists to do.
No, and that's it. It's not there to probe those deeper things. And the other thing as well, you say sort of Barbara has these conversations with Ortlock, who's the high priest, continually, and she actually does propose, or she sort of prophesies that the fall of the empire due to like you say, out of control human sacrifice. And she says at one point, I can foresee a day when 10,000 people are sacrificed to make it rain or whatever. And your eyes, oh my God, that's shocking. But I also know that the conquistadors are going to have a bit of a contributing factor in the downfall of the Aztecs, not just that human sacrifice. So as a historical teacher, you sort of going partway through going like, maybe you should say, do you know what? When some gold-seeking outsiders come, avoid them.
Right. You know how I showed up as a white woman and you thought I was a goddess? Yeah. Don't do that again. Yeah. Please.
Yeah.
White is bad. Yeah. Don't think we're demonic. That would be the thing to get into their minds if you really want to save them. I thought about that too. Like, how is human sacrifice going to save them? That's not how they fell.
Yeah, that was the thing. I was like, because she keeps talking about the fall of this thing. I was like, oh, you're not going to talk about Western expansion. All right, fine. We're not going to talk about the sort of the gold, the disease, the genocide, all within the next 40. All within the next 40 years of when this story is supposed to have taken place. So,
it's also, quite a whitewashing of European history, right? Those civilizations that we conquered, they fell due to their own flaws and brutality, and
Well,
we are the civilizing force.
that's
Which this
totally what
doesn't
this
say,
is.
but-
No,
right.
that's totally what this is. Like, and no, let's be clear. British audiences in the 60s were not. I'm not sure they're ready now, but like they were not ready to be like, yeah, we may have had a bit of a hand, but Spain had a much bigger hand in this. But you can apply this to India or great parts of Africa, Australia, and the Fiji, those sort of Caribbean islands, all gone.
Yeah.
Polynesian, culture only survives by sort of like by a thread because of how we treated them like hundreds of years ago. It's I don't think they were quite ready for that mirror to be held up. To be sort of like the Doctor going back, which happens now. Like,
Right.
I think happened even later in classic Doctor Who. But at this point, they weren't ready for this sort of, like you say, kindly sort of like slightly curmudgeonly old man to be like, yes, this empire will be brought down by you white bastards. So I'm like,
Right. You humans did this.
Yeah.
And specifically humans who looked like you. And of course, I say this in a country that's currently fighting over so-called critical race theory, because now there's a backlash against saying these things. So I guess I have to point out, like, this doesn't mean Western civilization is horrible, or that,
No.
Indeed, if the Aztecs had developed the wheel and sailed toward Europe, if they had been, if they had done that, it's not as if the Aztecs would have been, a paragon of 20th century humanity. It's just, this is the way it worked out factually.
Yeah, it's the same. We have these characters, like you say, and one of the things I hold most as an interesting comment in this is when they do highlight that there are two sides to the society, and that's true of everything. Like, yes, I'm talking about the conquistadors and the horrible things they did. Yeah, but the Spanish did an awful lot of other stuff as well. Art, literature, sort of, other parts of their culture, and the same for the British. Like, we hold up so Francis Drake as this, noble character in history, and you go, yeah. What was he transporting on some of his ships?
Yeah, right.
Let's not look below deck at the cargo, but let's talk about how he saved us from the Armada, or how he did this, or how he did that. Like, it's always going to be those things. There's always two sides to everything. Like, everything has a light and a dark side. And so, I just wish it would have been slightly braver to sort of have those conversations as well.
Yeah, and even it's worth pointing out that even the bad stuff. I mean, even when there's no school building and and of course the school buildings restricted native languages, but I mean, even when there isn't mass sanitation efforts and things like this that could be laudable. When we talk today about these cultures, they have been influenced by colonialism in ways that define their identity, and that present day Indians, present day. I mean, if you talk to somebody who is Christian in South America, it's not. Yes, there's an acknowledgement that the conquistadors were practicing genocide. On the other hand, I believe in a God that my ancestors were introduced to. So we have complex relationships, and it is that complexity that they sort of try to get a little bit of that with the Aztecs, but you're right, not willing to turn that gaze back to yourself, Hannibal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but again, like, if the writer of this had presented a script that was really sort of like got into the the really sort of, like you say, the murky edge of this, which is difficult and is difficult. Like, I'm not entirely sure the 60s BBC would have been like, we're going to make this. I think very much they'd have been like, can we just have them drinking tea and have a slight argument about this or that? Like, it's not what the television, these shows were designed to do at this time. Luckily, those things have changed. I think over time, I think there's been a lot more willingness to address these topics or these issues and discuss them. But this, like you said, this was children's entertainment, I think, and children's trying to be educational without sort of going like too far into sort of the darker reaches of history. Could have been interested, Monday morning, little Johnny comes into school. and sort of like 8-year-old Johnny comes in to teach. Excuse me, miss, what's colonialism? Did we? Can we talk about genocide today? I'm not sure they'd be ready for that in sort of 60s schools. I could be wrong. Any people that were in school in the 1960s, if you're listening, get in contact. Was it how was certain histories taught at that point? I'd be fascinated to know.
It does seem more interested in establishing, yes, the Aztecs had cocoa, which is quite right. I mean, quite famously so. But that sort of thing is more interesting than asking any of these deep questions. Right?
Yeah, this is for all intents and purposes, this is primary school level, information wrapped up in an entertaining show. However, I actually want to talk about the Aztec characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get sort of 3 primary characters. You get Ortlok, who is the high priest, who is the sort of like benevolent sort of Aztec sort of character. Latoxel, who is the sort of the scheming one, which I definitely want to talk about. And then Ixta, who is not particularly a bad guy, but clearly sort of trapped in this warrior mentality. And so has to have these has to live a certain style of life and has to keep proving himself to be the ultimate warrior, which is quite, again, is interesting. Before we get into anything about the actual character and everything, the guy who plays Latoxel, who is the scheming thing, like, I think he was auditioning for Richard III throughout all of this. Like at points, it was like I swear he was just sort of like, "Now, you Toxa, is the time of our discontent." Like he limps, he has a hunch, like he's really going for that kind of like that sort of like what I consider to be the stereotypical Richard III Shakespeare character. I kind of like it, I kind of dug it, but it was also kind of funny as well to watch. I don't know if it stood out to you at all.
I didn't think about that, but now that you mention it, that's quite right.
Yeah, he just looked. He probably has even played it. Like he had that sort of like the long curly hair and all this other bits. I was like, oh, you are so tapping into a character trait that you are comfortable with playing the villain. Like it's and again, advertising or clearly sort of like highlighting who's going to be the villain of the piece. By stepping on, it's like, and I am this character, and you will sort of like if we can't have mustaches to twirl in this episode, but I'm going to give you this sort of villainy traits. But I loved him. I think he's great. I really enjoyed Latoxel throughout all of this, like his scheming and his sort of like thing. It's all his villainy is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I go on. Just you enjoyed the fact that he was sort of such a fun bad guy. He's he's a bit campy. It's clearly a bit panto. Like it's what the show the because nobody else is sort of going there. Ortlok is playing very straight. The doctors and those characters are playing there. So to have this sort of like villain, like like you say, this sort of campy sort of like super, like you say, arch villain is. He just brings a sort of like a certain charm to everything he's in, when he's sort of leaning in and scheming, and he's like, in his backhanded moments of like because Susan, when she does refuse to marry, is going to be punished, and so that there is that thing, and Barbara said they refer to him as her servants because she's obviously you talk to this girl, and she's like, and bring my handmaid, and she's she will be there, and it's all that kind of stuff. I'm like, I'm loving this. This is brilliant. Like it just gives it an energy that like if he wasn't doing that, I think this would be a lot more dry. He just brings something that I think was needed. Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I do see that. I did like that. But I think that I was put off by the fact that he is the high priest of sacrifice and that he instantly takes this position and is like, that's not Yataxa. And the sort of I'll talk, sort of versus the priestess. And it sort of perpetuates this idea that the good and the bad of Aztec society, but in, that he's the embodiment of, human sacrifice is wrong. And of course, the guy in charge of that is going to be the scheming Iago sort of character. Whereas I think, of course, it's not fair to rewrite a show from this era. But I mean, I'll Talk is more interesting to me, especially in those moments where he's talking to Barbara and he seems conflicted. And he seems, like, yes, you are changing things. I have faith in you. My religion tells me to follow you. And I kind of believe that you're Yetaxa, but still have doubts.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say these things, I will implement them, but I'm scared to. I mean, I'm confused by if he really does believe that she's the goddess, why he doesn't just say, yes, I'll come out against human sacrifice and come what may, right? Let the chips fall where they may. But I quite like seeing, he's sort of the standout for me of sort of seeing him struggle with this historical imposition that Barbara represents.
Yeah, I know what you mean. He has got some interesting conflicts. And I also like them because one of the comments he makes is around that the people aren't ready for this. Because she's going to make some proclamation. And he's like, yeah, I'm not sure that anyone's ready for this. Like, it's a real hard stop of, like, because she calls out, like, killing people for, like you said, to change the weather or for crops. And she said, she basically said, like, it's silly, it's ridiculous. Like, we're going to stop it. And he's a bit like, well, trust in what you're saying because you are Yetaxa. I'm not sure how it's going to go down with, let's say the hundreds of people, thousands of people that live in the Aztec Empire. And so, yeah, it's interesting that his position isn't just of his own faith. It is actually almost defending the system of faith that they have within this entire. Because again, if you were to do that, like if she, and this is another interesting point. Like she's like, from her point of view, she's like, no, just stop it, just stop doing it. It's wrong. If you were to do that, like it would tear that society apart. Because you would have people going like Latoxel going like, no, the old ways are the right ways. We've been doing it for like hundreds of years. This is how the elders did. This is how we commune with the gods. Like this is what keeps us safe. And there's others that go, yeah, no, I can see what you're saying, but like, it wouldn't just because a god tells you that, like, he's obviously trying to act as that balancing between, what could end up being chaos. Weirdly, could bring down the society that she's trying to protect.
Yeah, or also I think about the imposition of monotheism in ancient Egypt, which caused tremendous social disruption and was violently led to a violent return to tradition.
Yeah,
that would probably be more likely than a permanent end to human sacrifice. And it's not just human sacrifice. She also declares that people shouldn't be punished for rules that they did not know, right? She imposes some other sort of morality. Yeah.
Actually, again, I sort of like that. Because this goes what to Latoxel's doing as well. That's a great point. She does, and she talks about, when punished. I think that's when Susan's going to be punished. And they make out a point. They're like, "You're a god. How do you not know these rules?" And this is what it keeps going back to this conflict of like, are you really Yetaxa or not? And she keeps doing things like that where you're like, yeah, you're not helping your case. Like, but the doctor keeps telling her these things. Like, basically, he's saying like, shut up. Like, all we want to do is open this tomb to get back to the TARDIS and leave. For now, they think you're Yetaxa. Live the dream, enjoy the figs, and just shut up. But she can't. Like, she wants to sort of help, doesn't she? She wants to try and make better this society.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to point out that the sort of separated from the TARDIS can't get. I mean, the TARDIS is such a sort of Deus ex machina that you could. I'm always bothered by the fact that they never use the TARDIS to go back earlier in the episode and prevent, like you have a time machine. No, not just that, but you can transport yourself into outer space anywhere in time, get a weapon or what you need and return. And so Doctor Who plots, not all of them, but most of them rely upon some sort of separation from the TARDIS or inability to use this ultimate device.
Mm.
And that is especially obvious here. But if you were going to redo this, you would sort of have that be the central problem of getting back to the TARDIS, and you would have Barbara, mistaken for, discovering that she is seen as a goddess, saying, no, I have a responsibility here. I have an opportunity here. I've been given power, and with great power comes great responsibility.
Mm.
I can stop this abhorrent practice. And you'd have more discussion of, right, is that your job? Is that, I think the Doctor, while he sort of says, you can't stop it, it doesn't come off as, and I don't think it should for the Hartnell Doctor, come off as a sort of moral position.
Mm.
It's not like it's wrong to, this is the violation of the prime directive of time, right? It's not so much that. It's just, yeah, you can't do that. It's not going to work out.
Yeah. I do like that every time sort of his preoccupation is getting back to the TARDIS, trying to find a way into that tomb. But every time she sort of says it, like he is flatly like, "Don't do that. Don't do that. I'm telling you, like it's not going to work out." And then he leaves again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do like that, like you said, that there's different. This serial has got several different sort of strands, and sometimes it does sort of like they feel a little bit too much. But it is interesting how they're trying to give them something to do. Because again, we should point out, one of the things I will point out is this is a 50-50 cast. 2 women, 2 men. But this series is predominantly the 2 teachers. Like the Doctor and Susan do very little throughout this, and Hartnell does some things. He ends up getting engaged, and it's sort of there's some moments that are quite funny. But by and large, he doesn't do a great deal. He's not the sort of the protagonist, like you say. This is where they realise that the Doctor is the engine through which the episodes occur, but the Access characters are always the companions. Like you are following these companions as your sort of like entry pieces. But Barbara's is probably the main focus, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think that this is worth pointing out that it's one thing that I think Davies did exceptionally brilliantly when he revived the show was to make Rose really the main character and the audience identification figure, and to but that was not true through most of the old show. Through most of the by the time you get to Baker, it's the Doctor Who show, right? I mean, he's the main character. And here, because of their ages, the teachers are the sort of classic ages for protagonists. And so it's really their show. And the show hasn't really figured out yet that, the Doctor is the main character. And then once you figure that out, you've got to make him funny and more likable. But I quite like how much I like sort of alien, unlikable characters and whatnot. I love the Hartnell Doctor for that reason. Although by this point, that's already softened quite a bit. He's not as just mean as he is in the early serials. But I want more with him, right? Like, isn't his he seems so unbothered by leaving is it Kamika? He seems so unbothered by leaving her. And he realizes that he's accidentally proposed to her. And then when he does leave, he says, I'll think about her all the time. Well, she's never going to be referenced again. Yeah. But there is there is an opportunity for sort of Jean-Luc Picard classic plot of sort of falling in love on the planet despite being an older man. And that we could easily do this today and have that be a fascinating narrative, but this show's not especially interested.
No, it's as you say, it's used to facilitate the plot to some extent, and is in some comedy relief.
Yeah, and
that's about it, really. But you're right. The Doctor's just not central to this at all, is he?
Right.
He's not the one that solves the problem. and it's actually Ian who goes, finds out about well, they've got the tunnel, then they go through the tunnel and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's not, he's not the one that sort of, now he'd whip out the sonic screwdriver, scan it over the tomb, and be like, oh, okay, well, there's a tunnel here. The vibrations tell me there's a tunnel up there. We've got to find that tunnel, and that would be the driving force for them to get to these locations. Here, they sort of stumble across it when they learn information from Ixta's father was the stonemason that created the tomb, and all these little bits and pieces. So, like, yeah, he's not the sort of Deus Ex Machina that he later becomes, and I do kind of like that. But I like you say, but I also like the fact that, like, he just breezes through this. Like, he's like, yeah, I'll spend some time in this garden. It's all right. I'll do some horticulture, and I'll drink some cocoa, and invent the wheel. And these little bits and pieces, and I do like that's what happens. But yeah, I wanted more time with him to get to know this Doctor, and I think that tells me I've got to watch more of the Hartnell years. But the point I want to sort of stress is, like, this is a 60s show with an educated, proactive female character, taking a lead, and I was a little bit surprised about that. Because again, like you said, that changes if you go to. They often talk about in classic Doctor Who, we're going to get to Ace. Okay, with the Seventh Doctor, we're going to get to Ace.
Right. But
before that, like, you did get some, but you get some terrible companions. Peter Davison and Sylvester McCoy had, and I forget her name now, it's going to drive me nuts, but like the redhead with the big red hair. There are Doctor Who fans screaming at me now to listen to this, but she was known for doing a show when she was a kid called Just William, and she was the sort of, like, I'm going to scream and scream and scream, and that's all she seems to do as the companion. And you're just like, why do they keep you around? Like, you're useless. But these seem capable and informed and educated. And you're like, yeah, I can see why the Doctor would go, oh, you'd be interesting to travel through time with. Let's go and have some adventures. And I thought that was interesting that the women are shown as capable. It's not just we've got to save them constantly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of partial to there's the female time. Again, Doctor Who fans will yell at me, although I'm American, so I have immunity. The female Time Lord companion, what's her name? From later Doctor Who. I always thought that was an interesting.
The Rani.
But, yeah. But you're right. Here again, sort of like the companions are the main characters. The Doctor is sort of a doddering guy. They're like, he, uses the TARDIS, but doesn't do that much. I mean, I think you're quite right that it would be fascinating to see more of him in the garden and see more of him just kind of like, yeah, I'm sort of enjoying hanging out here and having cocoa, with this woman. But it's amazing how much you're right that he doesn't drive or solve or even attempt to drive or solve the plot. I mean, he basically says to Barbara, you're impersonating a god. That's fine. Don't get rid of human sacrifice. It's not going to work out. But then he's quite content to go back to the garden. And in fact, if anything, he slows down the plot by giving Ixta this poison that's going to defeat Ian in a fight. It almost gets Ian killed. He sort of retards the progress of the plot much more than he takes charge in any way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because the whole thing. So he's looking for these manuscripts that detail how the tomb was built and any access points so they can get to the TARDIS. And you find that Ixta is the son of the stonemason that created it. And so, yeah, the Doctor thinks he's being cunning, but he's not. He's being played. And that never happens like later. Like, the Doctor is the one that's always in control. And in this one, like, he gets played for a bit of a tit. Like, the guy's like, yes, no, I shall bring this into, but I need to do this thing. Like, at no point does he go, there's only him and Ian that are left as contenders for this role of general of the Aztec armies. I wonder who he's fighting. And you're like, yeah, it's not, it's not a hidden answer. Like, he should come up with this. Yeah, he's like, yeah, here's this poison. This will sort of put them to sleep. And he's like, yes, I shall bring you those manuscripts. And then later on, even he, like, Ixta acknowledges, there are no manuscripts. I just lied.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh right, the Doctor was made like look like a fool. Like it's not the Doctor I'm used to.
Yeah, and not only are there two people vying for being general there, but also there are like 7 characters in this entire serial, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, I'm exaggerating. I mean, there may be 9 or something, but right, it should not be a great mystery. But I do kind of, you know, it's interesting. I like the meaner Hartnell of the earlier stuff. I like the sort of, you know, curmudgeon-y, meaner, but I do like the sort of doddering nature of this, that it's so different from what we're used to, and it's such not a Harrison Ford style protagonist, you know.
No, and that meanness has almost always stayed though. That it's almost like one of the things they acknowledge is that the Doctor, in all, just talking classic iterations now, has all you know, all future iterations to a varying degree will have that temper or curmudgeonness, or like, you know, not, they don't suffer fools gladly. And it almost becomes like the Hartnell sort of sets that template of like, oh no, there's that thing of like, he is fun and likes the adventure, but like, you know, in a crisis, like, yeah, he's not going to suffer fools. Like, he's going to get annoyed, and like, if you say something daft, like, he's going to call you on it. And my expectation is to continue seeing that played out in some of the Doctors.
I think that's true. But I think Hartnell was able to. It's less visible here, but I think Hartnell was able to be unlikable, to take that, you know. I mean, whereas by the time you get to like Baker, you know, Baker is, he doesn't suffer fools, and occasionally he is a little insensitive to his companion, you know, Sarah Jane or whomever, but not too much, you know.
Yeah.
He's pretty likable, and you get to, you know, obviously we'll get to some of the more silly Doctors who, you know, I mean, are more goofy than unlikable. Hartnell is an alien who is just not concerned. Even here, he's not concerned for what the others think of him. And I love that. I think that's, you know, it's sort of like, yeah, they are hitching a ride in the TARDIS. They're having their adventure, but, you know, they're kind of, you know, bumbling through this. But, you know, he doesn't seem to, he feels a responsibility to Susan, his granddaughter, but he doesn't seem to really care all that much.
No, he doesn't. No, he clearly feels almost like, well, I'm going to be all right, you know. And then, like, you know, there is a lack of care or sympathy or empathy with some of the companions. I want to get to the finale though. I want to get to the last episode because of the way this sort of reaches its climax. And one of the sort of the stories we haven't talked about is Ian's. And so Ian is drafted into the army. It becomes a sort of a contest between him and Ixter as who is going to lead this who's going to become an Aztec general. And what you find out is that Ixter was already the winner. He'd sort of conquered or defeated 7 other people, and then Ian was thrown in because he is the servant of a god. And so it's sort of then they have to fight, and there's all this sort of like, you know, machinations and stuff back and forth. And you get a couple of fight scenes. They are terrible. Like, and again, like, you know, this is one of the things I always find, like you say, this was filmed very quickly. And one of the things it's quite clear that they're trying to avoid is injury, because they're like, don't get hurt because that'll stop us filming the next scene. But they're trying to make it look like they're sort of like, you know, decking each other and stuff. And it routinely looks awful. The fighting does. But I never really think of Ixter as a bad guy. Like, they try and hold him up, but it's like, I completely understand his frustrations. He was like, no, I'd won this, and now you're literally putting somebody else in front of me now that I've got to defeat, and this is what I've been bred for. Like, my entire life has led to this, and now this pasty-looking pillock has been put in front of me. Like, you know. I just feel I kind of empathize with his position of frustration and stuff. And obviously he's not they show him as being he's a warrior, not a thinker sort of thing, because he gets manipulated throughout. But I sort of think Ian doesn't always come across as the best guy in this, because he's sort of like, but he gets like it's going to be to the death eventually. But even he comes across, like you say, they're trying to portray this sort of like Harrison Ford, like he's a really good example, Han Solo kind of character. But at other times he just comes across like a bit like of a prick, in all honesty. Well, he humiliates him. He humiliates Ixter, and then he sort of like, they have this sort of back and forth and all these other bits and pieces. And then Ixter sort of like tries to set him up, and I'm like, yeah, you could have handled this a lot better. Like, if you hadn't engaged in this and said to Ixter, like, yeah, no, I don't want this. Like, I honestly don't want to be the general of the army. It's like, you are the true one, but I want to come to a resolution without conflict. Like, they could have had an interesting conversation there about how to resolve this without conflict. Like, how does a warrior gain a victory without having to kill someone? All of that comes to naught because Ian kills him at the end anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I know what you're saying. Although I would say, like, Indiana Jones and Han Solo, part of their charm is that they are a little bit of a dick. Yeah. That's sort of programmed into the sort of white Tarzan, sort of adventurer. I mean, I don't think that William Russell as Ian sort of pulls it off quite that well. And I think he does seem sort of, he's supposed to be that sort of adventurer, but he does seem sort of oddly passive. And even in that fight with Ixta, it's like, oh, well, I mean, he's so good. He just trounces Ixta. And it's like there's no competition. This random British teacher just to easily defeat the strongest warrior of the Aztecs. It's absurd, not just the fights, but I mean, when they have that fight, Ian throws Ixta over and over again, and it's just crystal clear this is a one-sided battle in the most ridiculous of ways. So even the choreography is ridiculous, but what the choreography is trying to portray is doubly ridiculous. Yeah. But then Ian seems, you're right about not having that conversation. Like, Ian just seems to accept, this turned into a fight to the death. I was told this wasn't going to be that. He's totally fine. No questions need to really be asked about that. There's an odd way in which, he's passive, even though he does sort of warn Barbara about, the poison, and he does go through the tunnel and get back to the TARDIS. He does seem oddly sort of passive to me, despite him being sort of the main adventure character. Yeah, well,
that's what I mean. Like you say, when you talk about, like, we talk about Harrison Ford playing those characters, like, he has that rugged charm that allows him to pull it off. You need, and again, we're talking sort of Hollywood stars here, but like, the kind of people you can either have that rugged charm like Harrison Ford, or you have a cocky smarminess like a young Bruce Willis, where you can pull that kind of thing off, sort of. It's done with a swagger and a sort of thing. And, even I would say, I don't, in a similar period, is the Avengers of the 60s. I forget the actor's name, but like, he plays Steel in that. Steed, he plays the sort of the that same thing, that Bond-esque kind of quality, where you're sort of like, you can pull it off, like, you're a bit of a meanie, you're a bit of a dick, but I want to follow you because you've got that charm and that swagger. And Ian just does come across like a sort of a geography teacher that I'm like, you're just a teacher. Like, I've got no. But the conflict I sort of find, by the end of this, I was a little gobsmacked, because they've gone back and forth, and at one point they even say how they respect each other. Like they reach this thing of respect, and then it comes to a fight at the end. Ian knows they're leaving. Like, he literally, right? And they could, again, I'm surprised by this, because this is where my experience of Doctor Who comes from much later. This idea is like, wait a minute, give me 2 minutes. I've just got to kill this guy. I'll be there in a second. Like, firstly, the Doctor should be interceding to say, we're leaving. There's no point. This is pointless. You're killing someone for no reason. Where, like, he could eat, like, Ian should easily should lay down the weapon and be like, I'm leaving. I rescind any claim to the to the general position. You are clearly the better warrior, and leave. And that should be this sign of respect.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it's like the whole thing. Barbara's like been going up, like, trying to get off. Like first, you see the guy being sacrificed off screen. Like you see a hint of like what's going to happen. Like you don't see blood, don't we? It's the BBC. But then you do see him push this guy off the edge of a pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a little bit shocked that like he then gets in the thing and they're like, "Well, we're off now."
Yes.
That
it
shocked
doesn't
me.
need. I mean, I felt like I like because I like the backdrops. You know, I
it looks
like
good.
seeing Ixta pushed off. But you're quite right. It serves no real function except, you know, to give it a bit of drama. And I sort of felt like it's almost as if the writers and the producers, I mean, they clearly, you know, I think sometimes we remember things even about our own scripts and our own stories incorrectly. You know, they clearly remember this as the great Ian Ixta feud. You know, that, you know, one of them is going to win. We've got to resolve that and show that. And it's not going to be satisfying to just have Ian say, right, I'm off. Bye-bye. You know, enjoy your life. You know, you're a cool guy. You know, try not to get fooled so much next time.
Yeah, well, the two things, again, I know I always do this and I apologize, but like firstly, like why is Barbara not, when he comes on the TARDIS being going, hang on, did you just kill that guy?
Yeah.
Like Barbara should really have a problem with this. And secondly, like if you really wanted to show, because no one else is around, like no one else is there, you know, to see this fight. And to be fair, this is the only fight they film quite well. It's shot from above at an angle down, and there's a couple of moments where it looks all right. The rest of the choreography is dreadful because they have these like wooden paddle sword things that they clearly aren't allowed to hit each other with.
Yeah.
And so they are sort of making great pains to not hit each other, and it's hilarious to watch. But a better way to do this would actually be, if you want a really shock ending, is have Ixta win. And instead of killing Ian, he's like, I'll let you go. You will leave and will never come back. I claim this is a victory. I become the general. And the Doctor's like, yeah, get in the TARDIS, you prat. Come on, let's go. That would be the end of a modern Doctor Who, maybe. Right. And I don't know, it just felt so sort of like left field that they're just like, before we go, we are just going to kill some Aztecs.
Right. And, you know, of course, today we'd wonder, like, well, how does history change if you take Ixta out of it? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, he is he was clearly going to lead the military.
Because of Ixta, there was no one there to stop the conquistadors, and so the Aztec Empire fell. Therefore, the end of the Aztec Empire was down to Ian.
Yeah, that's right. It's Ian's fault, really. Yeah. But, you know, it does strike me that there's this sort of move toward identifying with the other, right? Mm-hmm. And that's part of what, of course, this counter revolution is doing now with critical race theory and, you know, objecting to take your politics out of my comics and all of this stuff. But, you know, there is, in the same way that, like, we've talked about stuff in the 50s and the 60s where we should be identifying with the robots. We should be identifying with those aliens. We're not expected to in this era. Today, they're the main characters, right? They're absolutely what's interesting and the good guys. And there's an ability to allow that sort of graze of morality. If Ixta was the good guy there and said, go ahead and go, right? I've defeated you in combat. Well, I mean, that would defeat the whole agenda, right? The whole agenda is that, you know, these white Britishers are superior and are instantly going to be embraced as a god, and Ian can beat the strongest warrior, right? I mean, to suddenly make you identify with the other and make that character of the other superior, right? Not just like Altok sort of interesting and having some interior space, having a head, but to really show that, Ixta could be superior, not just noble, but superior. Would sort of, that's unthinkable in the universe of this serial, right?
Yeah, And I think, there's an irony to this, because I've talked about 20th century people being sent back and overlaying their sensibilities and moralities to the Aztecs. I'm doing my 2022 sensibilities and moralities on a 1964 TV show. And so you are totally right. You have to take it for what it is and for when it was made. Because there's no way they were going to, like you said, like there's no way they're going to talk about the sort of the murkiness of, the introduction of the conquistadors, or the great expanse of actually how complex and sophisticated this society was, or like I say, make them sure that they are noble and they have these things like because I'm pretty sure the Aztec warriors did have a nobility and sort of place in society. Yeah, they don't want to talk about any of that. They want to talk about, they've got to narrow it down for the show, but also, like you say, there's this thing of like, I hate the phrase, and I know it's a derogatory term, but this idea of like the noble savage, you know what I mean? It's that thing of like, oh no, they are backwards, and they come from 500 years ago when things were all kinds of crazy. And so I see what you're saying. It's they couldn't, and they weren't ready for that kind of character.
Right. Well, and the other thing is, if you do that, and I've done the same thing of imposing 2022 values, but if you do that, then the thing that always gets me about Doctor Who is, the Doctor, whether he's a Time Lord or or whatever version, is not going to have 20th century morality. In other words, if coming from Gallifrey, my morals perfectly align with a 20th century British person. So if you condemn human sacrifice, I live in a country that's still putting people to death, right? Presumably somebody, maybe not, from a more enlightened culture would say, yeah, you're still doing this. You're claiming that it's because of guilt as opposed to it's an honor to die to bring rain. But I'm not sure how different that really is, especially given our error rate over here. And not to mention any number of other issues. If you begin to poke too much and have Ixta really be the good guy, then it's like, right, yeah, they're really backward because they won't let a woman determine who she wants to marry. I'm not human. You guys seem really backwards about women in a lot of other ways. Yeah. We don't want to get into any of that in the 60s.
No, exactly. Yeah. And it's not, like you say, it's not ready for that. It's, and again, I think the thing is, that wasn't the intent of the show at all, was it? This was a token, fun history snapshot. That's what the intention was. This was designed more than anything. I can imagine that this show was originally designed to be, we will drip feed some information so that hopefully a kid will take an interest, or a teacher will take an interest, and it will spark a conversation, and they'll read a book, or they'll do a lesson on it, or something like that. So I want to flip it around and go, because we have picked fault. That's what we do. But also, like you said before, you've got to admire the intent and the objective of what this show was at this point. It's not going to answer the really difficult questions, but for an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, it's going to go, especially prepubescent boys are going to be like, human sacrifice. What? Well, yeah, warriors. Oh, I want to know more about the Aztecs. That's clearly like, and also this thing of like, that female, their gods was a woman. Oh my God, that's crazy. That sort of, girls could be interested too. Like, I like the fact that they have attempted to do something that was different, and clearly was different to TV up until then. I think that's what this period was. And I mentioned the Avengers before, Emma Peel and John Steed. Like, that was another one. There's this period now where you do start to get these TV shows, and I think the Doctor sort of leads the way in that.
Yeah, it's not fair to put the weight of all of the things that we expect from narrative onto this designed to be disposable show from the early 60s. and to your point, I mean, how ambitious was it to say? I love that they said, well, we're going to give you the sci-fi, we're going to give you the Daleks, for God's sake, right?
Yeah.
Let's come on, right away. But I mean, it's the second serial, but we're also going to give these kids an insight, at least some sort of depiction and a few facts and a story that revolves around these different cultures and different people of history. And right, I mean, I could perfectly imagine, exactly as you say, kids going into school the next day after each episode, and sort of maybe the teacher discusses it. The other thing is, so there is that educational aspect, and the fact that, I mean, even trying to portray people of different races and cultures is a noble thing. That is, yes, it's not 2022.
Yeah.
There's no real interiority. It's not a full depiction like we'd expect now, but it is reaching out and trying to be really diverse, not just to teach history, and blessed are teachers, especially of history, but there is a diversity that's a part of that, and was always a part of that. And then I want to also say, I can totally imagine kids, as lame as those fights are, right? If I were a kid watching this, I would have made a cardboard sword myself, and I would have gotten my brother, and we'd be fighting behind the couch, playing Ian and fighting the Ixta, and maybe making a little Aztec headdress or something, And so there is a sense of, yes, there is an educational component here. There are diverse goals here that are awesome, but there's also a sense of fun that, even if it's not as fun for us with our modern special effects and quick pacing and everything, you can imagine how cool this could have been to somebody at the time.
Oh yeah, no, I can imagine, like, yeah, you say, like, 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, or like just watching this and being like, yeah, this is cool. Like, there's a reason. Basically, there's a reason that this ran from 1963 through to 1989. This, it lasted because it hit on a formula, and it starts with this. I mean, we are going to be going from doctor to doctor, and I think that's a sort of for us to lead into the end of this, really, is this idea of, like, yeah, this whole concept starts here. Yes, we're not going to touch on New Who. I'm sure we will make certain comparisons, but, like, yeah, we are about to. We now have a female doctor in Jodie Whittaker. We have incredibly diverse companions, and they are doing all kinds of things. The Doctor Who is now sort of, like, ubiquitous across British culture. Like, everyone knows who the Doctor is. But it goes back to this show in early 1960s, trying to do something new. And for all the things I will fault the BBC for, like, I will not fault them for trying these things. And they do it all the time. And so you have got to applaud them for even the minuscule budget that they give this show, this sci-fi show, that clearly sort of, like, led the way in a lot of ways.
Well, we love the BBC over here, and I'll do you one better. Doctor Who is not only a British cultural tradition, but especially since the revived show, has become an international part of being in sci-fi culture. Not of the status of Star Trek, Star Wars, but up there with, like, Battlestar Galactica, stuff that everybody knows of, even if they haven't really gotten into it yet. Nobody can go to a comics convention, a sci-fi convention, and not know of Doctor Who as an intellectual property. And while that is a side effect of the revived show and not the American TV movie or the long-running show, still, that's saying something. I mean, that's really, it's rare. We've talked how rare it is to have British sci-fi IP, take over and that, have international success to this extent. And it does go back to this formula. And as crude as this is, as lacking as this is in pacing and budget and fight scenes and all of that, there's a skeleton of a damn good plot. There's a lot of love being thrown at the costumes, and the central idea of this show, especially for me in the Hartnell years, is just really admirable. I love this idea. You could imagine the same idea succeeding on American television as a cartoon in the 80s, with that kind of cartoons that I watched of like, dumb Karate Kid nonsense, right? Here's a space adventurer, and we're going to have interpose, like fighting Klingon weird aliens. And then the next episode's going to be, Karate Kid going to a different part of the world or something, We would have loved that. I just think it's a great concept.
It is. And one of the things I'm interested in as I watch this, and we will get to more so when we sort of wrap up, is the legacy of this show. And I would say we've talked about New Who, and it came back in 2005, 2006. But between 1989 when it ends and then, there is still a legacy, because this still touched on people. Like, the reason Russell T Davies was able to pick it up was because he was such a fan. And the same with like Stephen Moffat. And there's there's people that are clearly, big fans of it, that's had such an impact on. But one of the weird things, as I was flicking through, I was going through the Doctors. I was just picking out some bits and pieces. I was watching some Sylvester McCoy as I was going through before we watched this. And Quantum Leap jumped into my head. And it just hit me. I was like, Quantum Leap doesn't exist without Doctor Who. And I was like, I wonder how many of the TV shows, because Quantum Leap is very 90s. I love Quantum Leap. Like, Quantum Leap was another one of those shows I watched when I was a kid. But I was like, yeah, that show doesn't exist without Doctor Who. That whole concept of like traveling through time into different people's lives, and the sort of the sci-fi being an avenue to actually talk about social issues or racial issues or class issues or whatever. Like, I was like, oh well, actually, this early Hartnell, I don't know. It just sort of struck me quite. I was like, there must be more. Like, I could probably sit and I'd have to think about it. But when we get to the end of this and we review back, that's something I really want to have a think about.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And I think you see, I've been through lists of Doctor Who analogs, and there are multiple Doctor Who analogs in the Marvel universe, multiple in the DC universe. Star Trek: The Next Generation had the Traveler that takes Wesley Crusher away, right? You have a lot of influence in shows, but you also have a lot of Doctor Who-like characters. And a lot of people have referenced it. And I think that it's a very different thing, because it doesn't have, like Star Wars, everybody still thinks of the movie, even though it's not a movie series. It's a TV series. It occasionally does movies, but it's predominantly a TV series. But everybody points to that original film as like, this is the template. Everybody is influenced by that, right? Battlestar comes out of that. All this other stuff, Star Trek revitalization comes out of that influences so much. But there's a singular thing that was big budget, massive audience internationally. Doctor Who doesn't have that. Doctor Who has this slow burn on the BBC, that it's there's not even one, people will argue about it, but there's not even one serial or one story that you can point to and say, everybody's seen this. This is the definitive Doctor Who old school show. Yeah. You can argue about it, but there's not a single one. And yet Doctor Who has this outsized influence, which I think is really fascinating. And it's amazing to see how different it was in the Hartnell years, and also how much was still there and how much they got right.
Yeah, it's that germ of an idea. I like this idea. You say this germ of an idea. This like you say, this thing that just sort of existed and grows. And one of the things is to round out is the Hartnell years were clearly successful for the BBC and reached such a level of popularity. There's actually a wonderful show, and there was for its 50th anniversary. They did, or 55th anniversary, I can't remember which it was now, but I think 50th. they did a show, and I'm gonna have to Google it now because it's really annoying that I've can't forget. I can't remember what it was, but they did a show that was like a docudrama reenactment of them filming the last episodes of the Hartnell years, and I'm gonna have to find it, and because it's going to really bother me now. So I'll go into Doctor Who, and I'll see if it's in there. But what it was basically, it was I can't believe I haven't taken these bleeding notes. It's really annoying me now. But it was, here you go, more you might like. See if I can find it. I'll tell you what, I can easily find it. So it was the guy who was the grumpy caretaker in Harry Potter. plays William Hartnell. Right, I'm going to find it now because I've got them coming up now. Bear with me. This is terrible podcasting, but I'm going to find the damn thing because it's really important. There we go. David Bradley. Here he is. Right, and David Bradley's brilliant. And it's called... Bloody hell.
An Adventure in Space and Time.
There it is. An Adventure in Space and Time. There you go. Thank you.
Apropos to our podcast.
It is. It was one of the things that influenced the title. And it's a dramatization of the early years of Doctor Who from 1963. And it follows through, and David Bradley plays William Hartnell. And it goes through to... it was released in 2013, so it was the 50th anniversary. But it goes through to the end, and the thing is, obviously, he's getting older. He starts to forget his lines, and there is this discussion of what do we do with it. And you see all the behind the scenes. And I highly recommend this because it's incredible. It's incredibly well done. But what they do is they get to the end, and they're like, actually, this is really, really popular. It's only William that can't. It's only Hartnell that can't do this anymore. Let's come up with this idea of the regeneration, and they do, and they obviously replace him with David Troughton, and they have this moment at the end. And I'm going to cry. It's ridiculous how much it's affected me. It was done by during the Matt Smith years, which is obviously when it was the 50th anniversary. And they have a moment where it's like David Bradley sort of like stood there at the TARDIS counter, and then Matt Smith's Doctor appears. And you're like, and it shows that bridge. And you're like, 50 years. It's going to be 60 years in a couple of years. 50 years of doing this show. And it just showed how important it was. And it was really impressive that they did this. And it was really touching. Even thinking about that, it gets me tears. That's something like Doctor Who. I'm British. I don't even watch it that in our DNA. It's ridiculous. But it's such a good show. Any Doctor Who fan, like I say, who hasn't seen it, if you're going through this, watch it. Because they then brought David Bradley back for a Christmas special because he did such a good job with Peter Capaldi. So when Peter Capaldi regenerated, it's called The Two Doctors. It's an episode they did with that, and they have this episode where time freezes, and it's a conversation between the 12th Doctor, Peter Capaldi, and then the first Doctor, and this idea of letting go and moving on. And again, that was wonderfully well done. And it's really, but again, they get to look at each other's TARDISes. You get to see this really like basic, version of the TARDIS that's obviously created for 63, and then this like massively elaborate like version they have for Peter Capaldi. And there's some wonderful things of like, why you've got so much. This is rather ostentatious for what you need and these things. It's brilliant, and they keep that use of that Hartnellness, that sort of curmudgeonliness, that slight sort of like charming meanness, and so it's clear that, like say, this character, this actor, it could have been throwaway. 65 or 66, I think it lasts to. They could have happily just gone, yeah, well, we're done. We had a good run. It was a fun show. It was educational. We're done and dusted. Move on. And it would be talked about people like you and I, as we talk about Quatermass.
If we even knew about it.
If we even knew about it. The BBC could have just eradicated it and it would be gone. But it doesn't. It lived on, and it starts with this. And it's like you say, we've poked fun, and we've sort of ridiculed it a little bit, but
I wouldn't say that. I mean,
no, but yeah,
we both love Doctor Who, and I mean, I think Doctor Who fans know that there are embarrassing elements of Doctor Who, and we
Oh, yeah.
love it anyway, right?
Yes.
But that's one thing that I love about Doctor Who, and I love about Doctor Who fandom at its best. There are some ugly sides of it, but Doctor Who fandom at its best is like an acceptance of, yes, we love this. We also know there are big problems with this, and
Yeah.
just some bad episodes and stuff, and but there is an embrace of that there isn't in the same way in, like, say, Star Wars, where it's like, no, god damn it, it's all good, and I will fight you.
Oh yeah, it's either all good or this is good and the rest is dire and must be destroyed. Yeah, you're right. There's I think Doctor Who fandom seems to be mostly welcoming. I'm sure there's been others that would disagree, but
not over here, especially online. But
yeah,
that's another time.
yeah, and we might get to that. The episode to mention, or the one I will mention, is called Twice Upon a Time, and it was released in 2017, and it was Peter Capaldi's last episode, and that has David Bradley in as the William Hartnell First Doctor, and it's absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed that episode. But yeah, I do think doing this is going to be quite emotional, because then looking at this and going like, yeah, these guys sort of like this rinky-dink show that shouldn't have existed or shouldn't have been a success was a success. And I think we talk about the writer of this show. The pacing is impacted by the way the TV was produced and had to fit 4 episodes. But like, the guy was clearly passionate about Aztecs, and he put that into the show. And the cast, like, again, they could be like, sorry, I've got to dress as what? I've got to do what? I'm sorry, I'm an actor. I don't do these kinds of things. I'm sorry. But no, they give it their all, and they do these things, and they wear the costumes, and they say these things. And I think, I give them full props for having done that, and creating these things. So it is important.
Yeah, and while I've said some critical things, or I wouldn't say mocked or something. I mean, I would say Hartnell is probably because of some that dynamic. Hartnell's actually, at least currently, we'll see how it holds up to this rewatch. Hartnell's currently, and has been for some time, my favorite of the original Doctors. And I know that's sacrilege, but I love Hartnell. I love the curmudgeon-y, really alien, premise, and I'm a sucker for it. I love those Dalek serials, and to your point about, like, I don't have quite the same nationalistic emotion, but I love it, but I am very inspired, and I think that all science fiction and all franchises should be inspired by the longevity of Doctor Who. And, it'd be very easy to just reboot it and say, this stuff isn't in continuity. This stuff is embarrassing. We're going to get rid of this, these episodes, or get rid of this Doctor. We do that so much these days. I love that it's all in continuity. My biggest problem is, the new series is strayed from that. But I just adore the idea of keep going. Yeah. If you love your franchise, keep going. Don't reboot it. Take another shot. Get stuff wrong. Have some laughable stuff in there. It's still got good stuff, but keep trying, and don't ever throw it out.
No, I agree. I think that's one of the things I'm most impressed with Doctor Who. Again, we'll get to that, because I think it stopped in '89 because of the new director of the BBC didn't like it. We'll get to that story when we get to it. But the thing about modern Who, like, so when it came back, Eccleston, the first series doesn't really, like, there's a slight acknowledgement of classic, but not much. It's very much like, we're starting with something new. It doesn't really come in until later in David Tennant, really, that you start to have this thing of you start to even get images of the original Doctors, and it's really then sort of hammered home. The continuity really is hammered home with Matt Smith, and in Matt Smith's first episode as the 11th Doctor, when I think it's like this massive eye thing comes down. They're judging the planet, and he says, "Look through your history banks, and you see all the doctors, and then he stands up and says, "Hello, I'm the Doctor," and it's like it shows you, it's like, yeah, there's a massive history. And if you're a young kid going, "Hang on, there's more," sort of rushing off to find it. And I kind of love that, like you said, that they've just cracked on and gone like, "Oh no, all that's canon." Like, yeah, we apologize for some of the costuming that may come up in the late, in the mid 80s when it gets really weird, like, but like, yeah, it's all canon, it's all there, the silliness, the seriousness, everything. And I love that, and I think that there aren't many things that can do that and get away with it. There's very few franchises that can have that dramatic punch whilst also going, yeah, no, we're the guy dressed as a tree, like,
Yeah, and if Doctor Who could do this, certainly we could say, Star Trek. I mean, Superman 3 and 4. You don't need to reboot the series because they're that bad. They're still funny and charming and weird and charmingly bad. That's fine. I love that Doctor Who embrace of all of it.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see more of that as we go on. There'll be sort of more of the weirdness, and I am going to admit, like, there's 2 Doctors on here that I've never seen, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And that's David Troughton and Pertwee. I've never seen anything of those, and so I'm quite excited to go and see how that continues. But we're not there yet. We're not going to. We're actually taking, weirdly, like, no, so not, I wouldn't say a detour. It's still Doctor Who, but we're still sticking in the 60s, and we're still sticking with the first Doctor. Just another iteration, as we did with Quatermass. Obviously, we did the Hammer films, so we are going to be jumping in, and we are going to be doing the first. We're doing one
second.
It's the second.
Right,
Yeah,
it's the second. It's a Dalek invasion.
That's
of
right.
Earth.
Yes,
Invasion
Earth. Yeah, Invasion Earth at some point in the future. We are doing the second of the Hammer Doctor Who films, in which Peter Cushing plays the Doctor, and they are in colour, and they were done as, again, to be sold internationally. So I'm really intrigued to see what we think of that, and I may actually go back. I don't know which way around I'm going to do it yet. Do I watch, because I haven't seen the serial, so do I watch the film and then the serial, or do I watch the serial and then the film? Because that's what I did with, obviously, the Quatermass stuff. So I think I'm going to have to think about how I approach that. But that's going to be in the next episode, more Doctor Who. So anyway, Julian, any final thoughts on Doctor Who?
Oh, it's charming to have this discussion, and I want to encourage you to let your inner Britishness out and get emotional and talk about what it means to you, because that is part of the treat for me. As somebody who admires this and has learned about this, but from abroad. So you're helping me and educating me.
I want to win to see that we are British. The emotions will be kept within within certain parameters and under wrapped. If I do show too much emotion, the BBC may actually be in contact. The Queen will be very upset.
Well, you're new British, just
yes.
so you can get away with it.
No, it will be emotional. I think as we get through them, there are going to be moments. I mean, and I'm interested to see how the conversation, especially with when we get to Sylvester McCoy, because that was my true introduction. Like, he was my first Doctor. That was that period, that late 80s. Like, Timothy Dalton is my first Bond. Sylvester McCoy is my first Doctor Who. Sort of like those first experiences are they imprint on you. They have an impact. So I'll be interested to see how we get to when we get to that. But in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you're enjoying. And if you do want to by the way, if you do want to watch all these Doctor Who's, they are readily available on. I've been watching them through BritBox in the UK. I think some of it's available on the iPlayer, BBC iPlayer. But for you, Julian, how have you been accessing
BritBox.
it? BritBox.
Yeah, BritBox over here too.
Okay, so BritBox is available internationally. It's not very expensive a month, and if you want to just sort of get through whilst we're watching this, it's a great way to. All the Doctor Who's are on there, and I'm just going to put a little bit of a BritBox in. We're not getting sponsored, but so much British stuff is on there. Like, I've been watching Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, Porridge, The Good Life, like all these sitcoms that I love. So, and there's loads of drama on there as well, and crap like Coronation Street. No, EastEnders is on there and other stuff. Ignore that. Fantastic British content. Go on and check it, including Spitting Image, original Spitting Image, and new Spitting Image, satirical politics, and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, that's besides the point. That's BritBox done and dusted. If you like what we're doing on Stories at Time and Space, go onto your podcast catcher, leave a review. We greatly appreciate all the reviews and all the feedback. 4 stars, 5 stars, preferably 5 stars, but leave a review. And if you really like what we're doing, go and check out Patreon. Patreon /20 CG Media. 20 CG Media. On there, you get the same level of analysis that Julian and I are now doing for Twilight Zone. Trekking through the Twilight Zone, we're going through every episode of the Twilight Zone and giving it a good, thorough shaking down. And then I do my 30-minute thoughts every month, and I've had Creator Corner, and I've had all kinds of fascinating people come on there. So go and check that out. There'll be a link below. So go and check that out. We appreciate all the feedback and all the support we get. So Julian, thank you very much.
Thank you. Onward and upward.
Indeed, yes. And we'll meet you on the next episode to talk about the Peter Cushing Doctor. Okay, see you next time.